Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Wednesday, 16 October 2024. It is the 163rd anniversary of the birth of John Bagnell Bury, better known to posterity as J.B. Bury, who was born in Clontibret, County Monaghan, Ireland, on this date in 1861. Like E.R. Dodds of a later generation, Bury was an Irishman who rose to a high academic position in England. In yesterday's episode on Nietzsche, I said that I never tire of asserting that history is not a science. With J.B. Bury, we have one of the classic expressions of the scientificity of history, since it was Bury who said, quote, "History is a science, no less and no more," unquote. In particular, it was J.B. Bury's 26 January 1903 inaugural address, when he followed Lord Acton as the Regius Professor of Modern History at Cambridge, an address widely known as The Science of History, that includes Bury's claim that, quote, "It has not yet become superfluous to insist that history is a science, no less and no more," unquote. The hedge of adding no less and no more to a simple assertion that history is a science suggests that Bury wanted to properly constrain the scope of scientific history. In other words, Bury was trying to manage expectations. We shouldn't expect from history anything more than we should expect from any other science, but we should, at the same time, also demand of history nothing less than we would expect from a science. Also, in my episode on Nietzsche yesterday, who was an elder contemporary of Bury, I discussed history as a form of knowing, a mode of understanding, and as a cultural force. I think Bury wanted to distance himself from all of this except for history as a form of knowledge. There have been a few philosophers of history who have claimed for history a status as a kind of substitute for religion or philosophy. As with most historians, Bury was suspicious of philosophies of history primarily because they are the work of philosophers and not of historians. In his essay, The Place of Modern History in the Perspective of Knowledge, Bury implied that philosophers had brought the philosophy of history into disrepute. Quote, "A large number of interpretations or philosophies of history were launched upon the world from Germany, France, England, and elsewhere. They were nearly all constructed by philosophers, not by historians. They were consequently conditioned by the nature of the various philosophical systems from which they were generated, and they did a great deal to bring the general idea of a philosophy of history into discredit and create the suspicion that such an idea is illusory," unquote. Making history a science allows for a distancing of history from philosophy of history so that the historian can put off all that has been said in the name of history by philosophers. When we put Bury's claim that history is a science in its fuller context, we understand better what he was getting at. So here's a little more context in the quote. Quote, "How recently it is that history began to forsake her old irresponsible ways and prepared to enter into her kingdom. That transformation, however, is not yet complete. Its principle is not yet universally or unreservedly acknowledged. It is rejected in many places, or ignored, or unrealized. Old envelopes still hang tenaciously round the renovated figure, and students of history are confused, embarrassed, and diverted by her old traditions and associations. It has not yet become superfluous to insist that history is a science, no less and no more, and some who admit it theoretically hesitate to enforce the consequences with which it involves," unquote. Here we see that Bury views history as a discipline in the process of being transformed into a science, but it is not yet fully scientific. Hence, it is not yet superfluous to assert the scientificity of history. In other words, Once history is fully scientific, it will eventually become superfluous to assert its scientificity because its scientific status will be evident to all. It has become superfluous, for example, to assert that physics is a science, but it is not yet superfluous to say the same of history. Bury repeats his claim in the final paragraph of his inaugural address, giving us further and slightly different context. Quote, just as he will have the best prospect of being a successful investigator of any group of nature's secrets, who has his mental attitude determined by a large grasp of cosmic problems, even so, the historical student should learn to realize the human story sub specie perenitatis, and that if year by year, history is to become a more and more powerful force for stripping the bandages of error from the eyes of men, for shaping public opinion and advancing the cause of intellectual and political liberty. She will best prepare her disciples for the performance of that task, not by considering the immediate utility of next week or next year or next century, not by accommodating her ideal or limiting her range, but by remembering always that, though she may supply material for literary art or philosophical speculation, she is herself simply a science, no less and no more, unquote. In this version, the claim that history is a science is used to underline that history isn't mere literature and is not philosophical speculation. History can be inspiration for literature and philosophy, but it's not to be mistaken for them. Also in this version, history should be seen in the largest theoretical context. The historian, Bury is suggesting, should entertain the big picture, even if his history, his domain of specialization, is more restricted in scope. And part of this seeing the big picture of history is distancing oneself from immediate utility. Whatever the scope or scale of our history, our perspective should be large and not dictated by the concerns of the moment. Bury even writes, quote, history ceases to be scientific and passes from the objective to the subjective point of view if she does not distribute her attention so far as the sources allow to all periods of history, unquote. Bury's conception of a big picture view of history is truly a big picture. I didn't expect to find a cosmological perspective in the 19th century in a historian, but Bury makes his cosmological point of view pretty explicitly plain. More than 100 years ago, in his book, The Idea of Progress, Bury is already developing a theme that is familiar to us today, the moral consequences of the Copernican demotion of Earth from the center of the universe. Quote, we may perhaps best conceive all that this change meant by supposing what a difference it would make to us if it were suddenly discovered that the old system which Copernicus upset was true after all, and that we had to think ourselves back into a strictly limited universe of which the Earth is the center. The loss of its privileged position by our own planet, its degradation from a cosmic point of view to insignificance, the necessity of admitting the probability that there may be other inhabited worlds, all this had consequences ranging beyond the field of astronomy. It was as if a man who dreamed that he were living in Paris or London should awake to discover that he was really in an obscure island in the Pacific Ocean, and that the Pacific Ocean was immeasurably vaster than he had imagined, unquote. Here, Bury sounds like he is channeling Carl Sagan's 3 generations before the fact. This is because Bury's belief in science and progress was what made the world of Carl Sagan possible. Clearly, for both Bury and for Sagan, the epistemic changes wrought by the scientific revolution were wrenching but worthwhile. Carl Sagan is entirely comfortable with this worldview that is still, for Bury, dreamlike and capable of reversal, at least in the thought experiment that Bury suggests. But the blandishments of progress don't come without a cost. Even for positivistic historians and scientists, there is a metaphysical cost to be paid though clever accounting can conceal the cost in otherwise unexceptional expenses. American philosopher W.M. Urban formulated Bury's project in a nearly metaphysical vein. Quote, "It is obvious, as Professor Bury tells us, that progress would be valueless if there were cogent reasons for supposing that the time at the disposal of humanity is likely to reach a limit in the near future. But he thinks that there is no incompatibility between the law of progress and the law of degradation, because the possibility of progress is guaranteed, pragmatically at least, by the high probability based on mathematical calculations of a virtually infinite time to progress in," unquote. I assume that in this quote, Urban was commenting on the following passage from Bury's The Idea of History. Quote, "As time is the very condition of the possibility of progress, it is obvious that the idea would be valueless if there were any cogent reasons for supposing that time at the disposal of humanity is likely to reach a limit in the near future. If there were good cause for believing that the earth would be uninhabitable in AD 2000 or 2100, the doctrine of progress would lose its meaning and would automatically disappear. It would be a delicate question to decide what is the minimum period of time which must be assured to man for his future development in order that progress should possess value and appeal to the emotions. The recorded history of civilization covers 6,000 years or so, and if we take this as a measure of our conceptions of time distances, we might assume that if we were sure of a period 10 times as long ahead of us, the idea of progress would not lose its power of appeal. 60,000 years of historical time, when we survey the changes that come to pass in the past 6,000, opens to the imagination a vast range enough to seem almost endless," unquote. Bury might be right in his speculation that for human beings, 60,000 years is endless for all practical purposes. But it's at this point that Bury and Sagan part ways, and in a twofold sense. Firstly, contemporary science presents to us a vision of the universe billions of years old, with trillions of years yet to elapse before its heat death. And the Earth itself is billions of years old and may be inhabitable for another billion or so years. Of course, that level of scientific sophistication in the age of the universe and the age of the Earth wasn't available to Bury, so he can't be held responsible for not comprehending the full depths of deep time. In any case, the billions of years of Earth's existence and the trillions of years left to the universe before heat death is still such an unimaginable quantity of time that 60,000 years is annihilated as if it were nothing, as the ancients would say that the finite is annihilated by the infinite. All the better for progress, you say. But wait. There was also, secondly, Carl Sagan's apocalypticism, which would have been utterly alien to Bury's belief in progress, seemingly inherent in the nature of things. Sagan's works are riddled with apocalyptic warnings of technology that threaten humanity with an uninhabitable world by AD 2000 or AD 2100, if not sooner. Dates that Bury set as being close enough in the future that it would make progress meaningless. Science, a century after Bury, has inflated the scope of the cosmos in space and time while deflating the hopes of human beings, and has ultimately failed to make history scientific into the bargain. The process of the transformation of history into a science, which Bury saw as being as yet incomplete in his time, has arguably ground to a halt, and history itself has become an arrested discipline, perhaps on the threshold of scientificity, but unable to cross that threshold. We could say that the prevailing wind at the turn of the previous century seems to have gone out of the sails of history. Something happened to progress, and with it, something happened to the progress of the transformation of history into a science. Maybe belief in progress isn't such a bad thing if it helps us to believe in ourselves and to push forward our projects, like the project of transforming history into a scientific discipline. We need a future worth believing in and a future within our grasp if only we will make the effort to seize it. Without the vision of a future achieved through progress, we lose the plot. The idea of the future appears throughout Bury's The Idea of Progress, and as in this seemingly complacent passage. Quote, as all the living forms of life are the lineal descendants of those which lived long before the Silurian epoch, we may feel certain that the ordinary succession by generation has never once been broken, and that no cataclysm has desolated the whole world. Hence, we may look with some confidence to a secure future of equally inappreciable length. And as natural selection works solely by and for the good of each being, all corporeal and mental environments will tend to progress toward perfection. Unquote. So we can fully agree today with Bury that yes, the amount of time that seems to be left to us on Earth is of what he calls an inappreciable length. But we can no longer so readily agree with Bury that all corporeal and mental environments will tend to progress toward perfection. In fact, we look forward to them running down due to the inevitable convergence on thermodynamic equilibrium. One could argue that there's a providential naturalism or a naturalistic providential philosophy of history in what Bury is saying, if this very idea of naturalistic providentialism isn't incoherent or self-contradictory. This brings us to the final paragraph of Bury's book on progress. Quote, does not progress itself suggest that its value as a doctrine is only relative, corresponding to a certain not very advanced stage of civilization, just as providence in its day was an idea of relative value corresponding to a stage somewhat less advanced? Or will it be said that this argument is merely a disconcerting trick of dialectic played under cover of the darkness in which the issue of the future is safely hidden by Horace's prudent God, unquote? There's a lot to unpack in this final observation by Bury. He seems to be comparing the modern belief in progress to pre-modern belief in providence. And this is what we could call a pregnant comparison, suggesting that pre-modern providential philosophies of history served a function not unlike modern progressivist philosophies of history. In other words, Condorcet is to the Enlightenment as Augustine is to the medieval period. This apparently superficial analogy is not necessarily misleading. The future is hidden from us, to be sure, but it was equally hidden from all who lived and died within the comforting bounds of a providential philosophy of history. We could argue that an idea as paradoxical as providential naturalism, a naturalism formulated on the model of providence with progress taking the place of providence, is not only incoherent, but inevitably will involve us in all of the problems of secularization that I've discussed in relation to Karl Löwit, Hans Blumenberg, and most recently, Hannah Arendt. Since this is exactly what was to follow in historical thought after Bury's time, I may not be too far off the mark in identifying Bury as the source of this idea. Happy birthday, J.B. Bury. Let me know what I've missed or what I've gotten wrong in the comments, and thanks for listening.